Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. We played with a Ouija board in an abandoned house. The board said we weren't alone. Part 1. The Dare We Couldn't Turn Down. I don't usually post here, but something happened recently that I can't get out of my head. It's been weeks, and I still get chills thinking about it. I figured if anyone would believe me, it'd be you guys. So, here's the story. It was a random Friday night. You know the type, nothing planned, just chilling at my friend Mike's place. It was me, Mike, his girlfriend Jess, and our other friend, Derek. We were all just trying to figure out what to do for the night. Derek had been scrolling through his phone for what felt like forever, and then out of nowhere, he hits us with this idea. Yo, you guys ever mess around with a Ouija board? Now, I'm not a superstitious person, like at all. Ghosts? Nah. Demons? Nope. But Mike and Jess, they were the kind of people who'd hear about Ouija boards and start talking about bad spirits and horror stories. Of course, they were both against it from the start. Jess was like, no way. That stuff's real. I'm not messing with that. Mike just shrugged, but I could tell he was freaked out too. Derek, though, he's always been the kind of guy to push buttons. He grinned and said, come on, don't be soft. Now here's where things started to get interesting. I'll admit, maybe I was a little bored. Maybe I just wanted to get a rise out of Mike and Jess. But I went along with it. All right, Derek, I said. I'm in. Where do we even get a Ouija board at this hour? Derek, being the sketchy dude he is, just laughed. We don't need to get one. I know where there's one. He then tells us about this old abandoned house on the edge of town. Apparently, it's been empty for years, and there's this rumor that some kids found a Ouija board there a while back. They messed with it, something weird happened, and they ran out, leaving the board behind. The place had this local legend around it. You know, the typical creepy abandoned house story every town seems to have. But what made this one different was that people swore they saw lights in the windows sometimes, even though the power had been shut off ages ago. I could see Jess getting uneasy, and Mike's face had that, I'm too cool for this, but I'm definitely not cool with this look. But Derek kept pushing. He said it'd be fun. Think about it. We'll have a couple of drinks, go to the house, and see if we can actually get the board to move. It's just a piece of wood, right? I don't know what came over me, but I said, screw it, let's do it. Jess refused at first, but after enough convincing, mostly from Mike promising it'd be just for fun, she reluctantly agreed. Honestly, I think we all felt a little invincible at that point. Like, what's the worst that could happen, right? So, we packed up a few beers, grabbed some flashlights, and piled into Derek's car. As we drove out of town, the mood shifted. It was subtle at first, just the usual nervous jokes and chatter. But as the town faded behind us, so did our laughter. There was something about that road. It just felt off. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to close in on us, or maybe it was the fact that there were no streetlights out there. Just endless dark. When we finally pulled up to the house, I started to second guess everything. The place was a wreck. Tall weeds had overgrown the yard, the windows were all broken, and the whole thing looked like it had been rotting from the inside out for years. A classic horror movie setup. Jess whispered something like, we shouldn't be here, but by that point, we were already too deep in. Derek, of course, was first out of the car, flashlight in hand, and grinning like an idiot. Come on, guys, what's the worst that could happen? He joked. He started walking toward the house, and the rest of us reluctantly followed. The front door was hanging off its hinges, creaking in the wind as we stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under our feet, and the air smelled like mildew and something else. It's hard to describe, but it was thick, almost suffocating. Derek led the way, shining his flashlight through the musty darkness. The walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper, and every so often we'd hear something rustling in the shadows. Probably just mice, I told myself. We found the Ouija board in the living room, right where Derek said it would be, covered in a thick layer of dust. It was one of those old wooden ones, not the cheap plastic kind you see at toy stores. There was something eerie about it, like it had been waiting for someone to come back. I didn't realize it at the time, but as I look back, that's when things started to feel wrong. There was this heaviness in the air, like the house was holding its breath. But none of us wanted to be the first to chicken out, so we cleared a space on the floor, sat in a circle, and placed our fingers on the planchette. For a few minutes, nothing happened. I was about to laugh it off and say we should head back when Jess, who had been dead quiet the whole time, whispered, "Did you hear that?" We all froze. It wasn't like a normal noise. No creaking floorboards or wind outside. This was different. A soft whisper. Faint, but definitely there. And it was coming from somewhere deep in the house. Before we could even react, the planchette started to move. At first, I thought it was Derek messing with us. But his face, he looked just as freaked out as the rest of us. We all stared in silence as it slowly slid across the board. It spelled out one word, alone. Jess was the first to break the silence, whispering, "We need to leave. Now." Her voice was shaking, and I could see the fear in her eyes. But before any of us could move, the planchette shifted again. Not alone. That's when we heard it. Something upstairs, like footsteps, slow, deliberate. We weren't alone. Part 2. Something upstairs, I can't even describe the feeling that hit me the moment we all heard those footsteps. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. We all froze, staring at each other, eyes wide, barely breathing. You know that feeling when you think you're alone, and then suddenly you realize you're not? Yeah, that, but 100 times worse. No one wanted to say it, but we all knew something or someone was upstairs. Derek, of course, tried to act tough. He stood up, shining his flashlight toward the staircase, his voice a little too loud for the eerie silence around us. "It's probably just the wind," he said, trying to laugh. But it was forced. Even he wasn't buying his own bullshit. Jess wasn't having any of it. "We need to leave, now." She stood up too, and I could see her hands were shaking. It wasn't just nervousness anymore. This was pure fear. The kind of fear that hits you deep in your gut when you realize things are way more messed up than you thought. But before any of us could move, the footsteps came again. Closer this time. Slow, dragging footsteps, like whoever or whatever was up there wasn't in a rush. Like it knew we weren't going anywhere. I looked at Mike, hoping he'd say something, do something, but he just stared at the ceiling. His face was pale, and for the first time since we got there, he looked terrified. This wasn't the usual Mike. He was always the calm one, the guy who didn't believe in any of this supernatural crap. But now, he was dead silent, his eyes wide, locked on the ceiling. "Guys, we should go," I whispered. My voice sounded shaky even to me. Derek, though, man, I don't know if it was the adrenaline or if he just couldn't handle the fear, but instead of leaving, he started up the stairs. "I'll check it out," he said, like we hadn't just heard something up there. The wood creaked beneath his weight as he ascended, flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. "Derek, are you crazy?" Jess hissed, grabbing his arm, but he just shrugged her off. "There's nothing up there. You're all just freaking yourselves out," he said, but his voice wasn't as confident as he wanted it to be. We stood there, frozen, as his flashlight beam disappeared up the stairs. For a few moments, all we could hear was Derek's footsteps creaking on the old wooden stairs. Then silence. I'm not talking the usual kind of silence, like when everyone's waiting for something to happen. This was different. It was like the house itself had swallowed every sound. Even the wind outside had stopped. Everything felt wrong. "Derek!" Mike called, his voice barely above a whisper. Nothing. And then, from somewhere upstairs, we heard him scream. It wasn't a startled yelp or some half-hearted attempt to scare us. No, this was a full-on, gut-wrenching scream. The kind that chills your bones and makes the hairs on your neck stand up. Jess was already halfway to the door, pulling on Mike's sleeve, practically begging him to leave. "Mike, please, we need to get out of here." Her voice cracked, and for a second, I thought she was going to start crying. But Mike wouldn't move. "We can't just leave him," he said, his voice shaky. I could see his hands were trembling too. Before any of us could decide what to do, there was this thump from upstairs. Something heavy, like a body hitting the floor. Then another, and another. The sounds were getting closer, moving toward the staircase. I swear to you, it sounded like something, or someone, was dragging themselves down the stairs, hitting each step with a sickening thud. But there was no way it was Derek. Not the way the sounds were coming. It was heavier, slower. Jess let out a soft whimper, stepping back toward the door, and honestly, I don't blame her. I wanted to run too, but my feet wouldn't move. It's like they were glued to the spot. My brain was screaming at me to leave, but my body was frozen in place, like I had to see what was coming down those stairs. And then, just as we all stood there, holding our breath, the beam of Derek's flashlight flickered at the top of the stairs. And that's when we saw him. At first, I thought it was Derek. I really did. He was slumped against the wall, his face hidden in the shadow, his body limp, like he was struggling to keep himself upright. But the more I stared, the more I realized something was wrong. His clothes, they were covered in dirt, like he had been dragged through the mud. But it wasn't just that. His arms, his legs, they looked wrong, like they were bent at odd angles. It was like he was broken, not just injured, broken. "Derek!" Mike called out, his voice trembling. But Derek didn't answer. He just stood there, his head slowly lifting toward us, revealing his face in the beam of the flashlight. And man, that's when I lost it. That's when I knew we had made a huge mistake. His eyes weren't right. They were wide, way too wide, like he was staring at something behind us, but it wasn't just that. There was something in them. Fear. Pure, primal fear. And his mouth, it was hanging open like he was trying to scream, but no sound was coming out. Jess grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door, and for the first time, I didn't fight her. "We need to go. We need to go right now," she whispered, her voice trembling. But before we could make it to the door, Derek, or whatever was left of him, moved. It wasn't like a normal movement, though. It was jerky, almost like he was being pulled by strings, his limbs twitching and bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. And with each step, he took down the stairs. His body made this horrible cracking sound. I'll never forget the sound. We bolted, all of us. Mike, Jess, and I didn't even wait to see what would happen next. We ran, out the front door, through the overgrown yard, and straight to the car. I could still hear those cracking footsteps echoing behind us as we scrambled into the car. Jess was crying. Mike was fumbling with the keys, and I just kept looking back at the house, waiting for Derek to come out, waiting for something. But he never did. We peeled out of there, the house disappearing into the darkness behind us. And as we sped away, I could have sworn I saw something in the upstairs window. A shadow, watching us. I haven't seen Derek since that night. Part 3. Derek wasn't the same. We didn't talk on the way back. I don't think any of us even knew what to say. The silence in the car was thick, except for Jess's soft sobbing in the back seat. Mike gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, and every time I glanced at him, I could see he was just as shaken as the rest of us. even if he was trying to hold it together. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we had just seen. But there was no way to explain it. No logical reason why Derek would move like that, or look like that. We pulled into Mike's driveway, and for a second, none of us got out. It was like we were too afraid to leave the car, like stepping out meant we'd have to deal with what just happened. I could see the glow of the porch light, but it felt so distant, like the safety of Mike's house was miles away. Jess was the first to break the silence. What do we do? Her voice was barely more than a whisper, her eyes red and swollen from crying. We can't just leave him there. We have to call someone. Mike finally spoke, his voice hollow. And tell them what? That we saw Derek. What? Get possessed by a Ouija board? That he walked down the stairs like a broken doll? He ran his hand through his hair, clearly frustrated, but I could tell he was scared too. No one's going to believe us, I added quietly. And I meant it. I mean, would you? If I hadn't been there, I wouldn't have believed it either. What were we supposed to say? The police would laugh us off, or worse, think we were on something. Jess just stared at us, her eyes wide, desperate for an answer that none of us had. But Mike was right. There was no way to explain what happened, at least not in a way that made sense. And that's when Mike made the call. I didn't see coming. We'll go back tomorrow, in daylight. Jess looked like she was about to argue, but then she just nodded weakly. I wasn't too thrilled about it either, but what else could we do? We couldn't leave Derek there forever. We had to know what happened to him. So, we all went our separate ways, though I don't think any of us got any sleep that night. I sure as hell didn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see Derek's face. Those wide, terrified eyes. The way his body had moved, twisted like something else was controlling him. I didn't want to think about what could have been upstairs, or what still might be there. The next morning, we met back at Mike's place. No one said much, but the tension was thick. We grabbed some flashlights, and this time, brought a crowbar just in case. Mike had a baseball bat in the trunk. We weren't planning on running into anything, but we weren't taking chances either. When we pulled up to the house again, it didn't look any different, but the vibe was completely off. In the daylight, the place didn't seem as menacing, but it was still unsettling. The windows were dark, gaping like empty eyes staring down at us. I could feel my heart beating faster just walking up the path. The front door creaked as we pushed it open, the same one we had run through in a blind panic just hours before. It was still hanging crooked on its hinges, and the inside, everything looked just the way we left it. The dusty old Ouija board was still sitting on the floor in the living room, the planchette lying right where it had been. But there was no sign of Derek. No blood, no body, nothing. "He's not here," Jess said quietly, her voice breaking the heavy silence. Her eyes darted around the room, like she was expecting him to jump out at us any second. But there was nothing, no sound, just the eerie quiet of the abandoned house. Mike stepped forward, glancing up the stairs, his flashlight beam cutting through the dust floating in the air. "We should check upstairs. That's where we last saw him." I didn't want to go upstairs. None of us did, but we didn't have much choice. If we wanted to find out what happened to Derek, we had to go up there. So we did. One step at a time, the old stairs creaking beneath our weight. When we reached the top, the hallway stretched out before us, dark and narrow. The air was thick, stale, like no one had been up there in years. I could feel my pulse quicken, the dread settling in my stomach. Something about that upstairs just felt wrong. We checked the rooms one by one. Each one was empty. Dusty old furniture, broken windows, but no sign of Derek. Not until we got to the last room at the end of the hall. The door was already half open, and as Mike pushed it the rest of the way, the smell hit us. It was faint but unmistakable, the smell of something rotting. I swallowed hard, my stomach turning. Mike stepped inside first, shining his flashlight around. The room was small, just a bed with a mouldy mattress and an old dresser. The floorboards were warped and covered in grime, but there, in the corner, was something else. A pile of dirt. But it wasn't just dirt. It looked like something, or someone, had been dragging it across the floor. There were long, uneven streaks leading from the pile to the window, like something had been crawling out. And then we saw it, on the wall, just above the pile of dirt, scratched deep into the plaster. Not alone. The same words the Ouija board had spelled out. The same words that had appeared right before Derek. Changed. Jess let out a soft gasp, covering her mouth. No! 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 We need to get out of here, Mike said, his voice tight with panic. But before we could move, there was a sound from downstairs. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, dragging, just like the night before. We all froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The sound of those footsteps, that slow, deliberate pace. It was the same. The exact same. Something was coming up the stairs. Jess grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and I could feel her whole body trembling. Mike backed up toward the door, but his flashlight beam was shaking so badly, I don't think he could even see where he was going. And then, as the footsteps grew closer, the door at the end of the hall creaked open. We were trapped. That's when I saw it. Just for a split second, but I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway at the bottom of the stairs. Tall, dark, with those same wide eyes. But it wasn't Derek. It wasn't even human. Part 4. The thing in the hallway. I swear to you, in that moment, I felt like my brain was short-circuiting. I was staring at something that shouldn't exist, something my mind just couldn't process. It wasn't Derek. It couldn't be Derek. The figure at the end of the hall was taller, its body too thin, almost stretched out. Its arms dangled unnaturally, nearly reaching the floor, and those eyes, those horrible, wide eyes. They were fixed on us, and its mouth, God, its mouth was stretched too, open in a way that no human mouth could ever be. It didn't look like it was smiling. It looked like it was straining. The skin around its lips was pulled tight, like it had been forced open, held in place by something unseen. For a second, nobody moved. None of us even breathed. We were frozen, caught between running and the terrifying realization that there was nowhere to go. That thing was blocking the only exit. Then slowly, the thing in the doorway stepped forward, its foot hitting the first stair. The wood creaked beneath its weight. It wasn't in a hurry. It didn't need to be. It knew we were trapped. Jess whimpered, and I felt her nails digging into my arm even harder. Mike was gripping the baseball bat like his life depended on it, which, at that moment, it probably did. His flashlight beam flickered, barely holding onto the light, casting twisted shadows on the walls. I was gripping my own flashlight so tight my fingers were starting to go numb. "Wah! What do we do?" Jess whispered, barely able to get the words out. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. We could only watch as that thing slowly ascended the stairs, its movements stiff, like it was learning how to walk again. The sounds it made, God, I can still hear them. The soft creak of the floorboards, the wet, dragging noise, like something slick was trailing behind it. I didn't want to know what that sound was, but I couldn't help but picture it. Blood? Something worse? Mike took a shaky step toward the doorway, raising the bat, his breath coming out in quick, shallow gasps. "Stay behind me," he whispered, his voice tight, as if he was trying to convince himself more than us. But I could see his hands shaking, and honestly, I wasn't sure if he was going to swing or drop the bat entirely when the thing reached us. Step by step, it came closer. I could feel the temperature drop in the room. It wasn't a gradual cold, like a draft in an old house. It was sudden, like we had been plunged into ice water. My breath came out in short, visible puffs, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give out. Jess had gone completely silent, but I could feel her trembling next to me. Mike took another step forward, his back almost to the door, but it didn't matter. The thing was on the top step now, just a few feet away from us. That's when it spoke. At least, I think it spoke. The sound that came out of its mouth wasn't right. It was like a low, wet whisper, a gurgling noise that crawled inside your head and made your skin crawl. But I understood the words. We are not alone. Those same words. The ones from the Ouija board. The ones carved into the wall upstairs. I felt my stomach drop, and I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My throat had closed up. We were in a nightmare, and there was no waking up. Mike, bless him, finally lost it. He swung the bat with everything he had, aiming straight for the thing's head. But the second the bat connected, it was like he had hit solid stone. The bat just stopped, the sound echoing through the hallway like a thunderclap. The impact knocked Mike off balance and he stumbled back, nearly falling into the room behind him. The thing didn't even flinch. It stood there, staring at us with those awful eyes, and I could have sworn I saw its mouth widen just a little more, if it was even possible. Mike scrambled back to his feet, but by then, it was too late. The thing stepped forward again, closing the distance between us in one long, jerky stride. That's when I saw it, what it had been dragging behind it the whole time. At first, I thought it was a shadow, something cast by the dim flashlight beams. But then I realized it was attached to the thing. It wasn't just standing there. Something was slithering out from its back, long and black, coiling and twisting like smoke. But it wasn't smoke. It was solid, and it was moving toward us. Mike swung the bat again, but this time, the black tendril shot out and wrapped around it, yanking it from his hands with such force it sent him crashing to the ground. The bat clattered uselessly across the floor. I wanted to run. I wanted to grab Jess and Mike and get the hell out of there. But my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what was happening in front of me. The thing inched closer, and the black tendrils started to reach out toward us. They twisted through the air, almost lazily, like they had all the time in the world. And that's when I heard something I'll never forget. A voice, but not the thing's voice. This one was different, higher pitched, familiar, and it was coming from the thing's mouth. "Help me!" It was Derek's voice. I don't know how, but it was. Twisted and distorted, but it was him, and it was coming from inside that thing. I could hear the fear, the desperation, the horror in his voice. He was inside it, somehow. That was the breaking point for Jess. She screamed, the loudest, most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard, and bolted for the stairs. I barely had time to register what was happening before she was pulling me with her, her grip on my arm so tight I could feel my skin bruising. We didn't stop. We ran. Down the stairs, through the rotting hallway, out the front door. I could hear Mike behind us, his footsteps pounding the floorboards as we tore across the yard, the tall weeds slapping at our legs. We didn't look back. I didn't care what was behind us, whether it was Derek or that thing, or both. All I knew was that we had to get away. We dove into the car, and Mike slammed his foot on the gas, gravel spraying as we sped down the road, leaving the house and whatever was inside it behind us. Jess was sobbing uncontrollably in the back seat, and Mike's hands were shaking so bad I thought he was going to crash the car. But none of us spoke. None of us could. As we drove, I glanced back at the house one last time, half expecting to see that thing standing in the doorway, watching us go. But there was nothing. Just the empty dark windows, staring back at us like hollow eyes. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, back in town, where the streetlights felt like a lifeline, glowing in the darkness. But even now, even as I sit here writing this, I can still hear Derek's voice. That last horrible plea for help echoing in my head. And I keep wondering, if that thing wasn't Derek, where is he? Part 5. We weren't the only ones. I don't think any of us spoke for the next couple of days. I mean, how could we? How do you talk about something like that? We had no idea what we had seen, no idea what had really happened to Derek, or what we had even run from. Mike, Jess, and I just kind of avoided each other. I think we were all trying to pretend that maybe, just maybe, if we didn't talk about it, it wouldn't be real. But it was real. And none of us could shake the feeling that whatever had happened back at that house, it wasn't over. I didn't want to admit it at first, but things started happening. Small things. At first, I tried to brush them off. Random noises in the house, objects not being where I remembered putting them. You know, the kind of stuff that makes you second-guess yourself but isn't enough to set off any real alarms. But then, it got worse. One night, I woke up to a scratching sound coming from the wall next to my bed. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, like something was trying to dig its way through the plaster. I turned on the light, half expecting to see a mouse or something, but there was nothing, just the scratch marks on the wall. 3 long, deep scratches, like claws had been dragged across the surface. The next day, Mike called me. He sounded off, like he hadn't slept in days. "I've been hearing him," he whispered. "Derek. I swear to God I've been hearing him." I didn't know what to say. My first instinct was to tell him he was just imagining things, that his mind was playing tricks on him after everything we had been through. But the truth was, I had been hearing him too. Late at night, when everything was quiet, I'd hear whispers. Soft, barely there whispers that sounded like Derek's voice, calling my name. They never lasted long, just a few seconds at most, but they were enough to make me question my sanity. Jess, though, she had it the worst. One night, about a week after we fled the house, I got a frantic call from her. She was crying, almost hysterical, and I could barely make out what she was saying. I rushed over to her place, and when I got there, she was sitting on the floor in her living room, surrounded by broken glass. Every single window in her house had been shattered. "It was him," she kept saying over and over. "It was Derek. He was outside. He was at my window." I tried to calm her down, but I knew in my gut that whatever she had seen, or thought she had seen, it wasn't Derek. Not anymore. The 3 of us met up the next day, back at Mike's house. We needed to talk. We couldn't keep pretending that nothing was happening. We had to figure out what was going on, and more importantly, how to stop it. We sat around Mike's kitchen table, the air thick with tension. Jess still looked shaken, her hands trembling as she held her coffee cup. Mike had dark circles under his eyes, and I could tell he hadn't slept in days. None of us had. "I think it followed us," Jess said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What followed us?" Mike asked, his voice tight. She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "That thing. Whatever was in the house. It's not just there anymore. It's here. It's with us." I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was right. We hadn't left the house behind. It had come with us. It had latched onto us somehow, and now we were all stuck in this nightmare. Mike leaned forward, rubbing his temples. "What the hell do? We can't just live like this." That's when I said it. "We have to go back." Jess and Mike both stared at me like I had lost my mind, and maybe I had. But there was something in the pit of my stomach, something telling me that we couldn't just ignore this. Whatever was happening to us, whatever had followed us, it had started at that house. And the only way to stop it was to go back, to face it. Mike shook his head. "No way, I'm not going back to that place." "Then what?" I shot back. "What's the alternative? We just wait for it to pick us off one by one, because that's what's going to happen." Jess didn't say anything, but I could tell from the look on her face that she was already considering it. She knew it too. We couldn't outrun whatever this was. So, despite every instinct in our bodies screaming at us not to, we went back. It was just after sunset when we pulled up to the house again. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. The house stood there, looming in the fading light, its broken windows like dark, empty eyes. The last place any of us wanted to be. We didn't talk as we walked up the path, our flashlights cutting through the gathering darkness. The front door was still hanging off its hinges, and the second we stepped inside, I felt it. That same suffocating pressure in the air, like the house was alive, watching us, waiting. We didn't waste time. We went straight to the living room where the Ouija board had been. But this time, there was something different. The board was gone. "Where is it?" Mike asked, his voice tight with panic. I scanned the room, my flashlight beam bouncing off the cracked walls. That's when I saw it. In the corner, where the pile of dirt had been before, something was scrawled on the wall, scratched deep into the plaster. "Come back." Jess let out a soft whimper, backing up toward the door. "We need to leave, now." But before we could move, there was a sound from upstairs. That same dragging noise. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Jess froze, and Mike stepped back, his eyes wide. We all knew what it was. That thing. It was still here. "Come on, we need to..." I started, but then the lights flickered. For a moment, everything was plunged into darkness, and when the lights came back on, something was standing at the top of the stairs. It wasn't Derek. It was that thing, tall, twisted, its body stretched and bent in ways that didn't make sense. And those eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes, locked onto us. But this time, there was something else. There were others. Figures, just like the one at the top of the stairs, began to appear out of the shadows. One by one, they stepped forward, their twisted limbs and gaping mouths moving in jerky, unnatural motions. We weren't alone. We had never been alone. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Jess's arm and pulling her toward the door. Mike was already ahead of us, sprinting through the hallway, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The house felt like it was closing in on us, the walls narrowing, the air growing heavier with every step. But just as we reached the front door, it slammed shut. Jess let out a sob, pounding on the door with her fists, but it wouldn't budge. The figures were closing in, their movements slow but deliberate, their wide eyes never leaving us. I turned around, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it. Derek, standing among them, his face pale, his eyes wide with that same horrible, empty stare. He wasn't Derek anymore. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out, just that same twisted, gurgling noise, the sound of something long dead, trying to speak. And then, everything went black. That's the last thing I remember before waking up outside. Jess and Mike were there too, lying in the dirt beside me. We were back in the yard, the house looming above us like a dark shadow. But the figures, they were gone. The house was silent again. We never talked about what happened that night. We never went back to that house. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear Derek's voice, calling my name. The Ouija board gave me instructions to bury something in the woods. I don't remember what happened after. Part 1. The game we shouldn't have played, so this is going to sound insane, but stick with me. It started about 3 months ago. My buddy, Josh, had always been the kind of guy who was into weird stuff. Like while most of us were playing video games or watching sports, he was reading about conspiracy theories, diving into all these crazy deep web forums and collecting the weirdest stuff you can imagine. You know that one friend you always have who's a little off? Yeah, that was Josh. One Friday night, Josh had the brilliant idea of hosting a throwback night, basically hanging out and doing the stuff we used to do as kids, but with beer. There were 5 of us, me, Josh, my girlfriend Sarah, and 2 of our other friends, Brian and Kaylee. It was just supposed to be a fun, nostalgic hangout. Josh, being Josh, took it way too seriously. He had a VHS player hooked up to this giant boxy TV he got from some sketchy pawn shop, stacks of old horror movies ready to go, and snacks from the 90s that somehow still existed. Honestly, It was kind of fun at first. We were all in that weird, let's relive our childhood mood, and it felt like we'd hit the peak of our chill night. That was until Josh brought out the Ouija board. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I've always thought Ouija boards were just a joke. Like, we've all heard the stories, right? The urban legends about spirits and demons and all that crap. But I figured it was just something people made up to freak out their friends. Josh was insistent, though. "Come on, it's not that serious," he said. "It's just a game." He was grinning in that way that told me he was half serious, half expecting to freak us out for laughs. Sarah and I exchanged a look, and I could tell she wasn't feeling it either. But everyone else seemed to think it was a great idea. Brian cracked a beer and slumped onto the couch going, "Why not? Let's see if we can talk to ghosts." Kaylee was intrigued too, of course. She'd been into crystals and spiritual stuff lately, so this was probably right up her alley. So, we all sat around this old wooden table in Josh's basement. It had this weird, low light from a single lamp, casting shadows that felt a little too long for comfort. He laid the board down in the middle, this worn-out-looking piece of cardboard with faded letters, and we each put our fingers on the planchette. To be honest, I was already on edge, but I didn't want to be that guy, the one who chickens out. Josh started asking the usual stuff like, "Is anyone here with us?" and "Can you hear us?" At first, nothing happened. We were all just sitting there in awkward silence, kind of waiting for the next move. Sarah let out a small laugh and said, "See, it's just a piece of cardboard." Then the planchette moved. I swear none of us were touching it. My first thought was that Josh was messing with us. He was always that kind of prankster. But when I looked at his face, I saw something different. His grin had vanished, and his expression was dead serious. The planchette slid over to the word yes. We all sort of froze, exchanging nervous glances. Josh cleared his throat and asked, "Who are we talking to?" No response. I was just about to make a joke to break the tension when the planchette moved again, this time slowly, letter by letter. M-O-T-H-E-R. It spelled out mother. That's when Kaylee, who had been mostly quiet up until that point, gasped. She stood up, almost knocking over her chair, and backed away from the table. "I don't like this," she whispered. "We should stop." But Josh, of course, was all in now. "Wait, no, this is getting good. Who is Mother? Are you trying to tell us something?" The planchette started moving faster now, almost erratic, like it was being yanked around. B-U-R-Y. Then it paused. We were all staring at it, confused but not daring to let go. And then it spelled out the last word, B-O-X. "Bury the box?" Brian asked, sounding more skeptical than scared. None of us had any clue what it meant, but I noticed Sarah's face had gone pale. She whispered, "We need to stop." Josh ignored her. "Where? Where do we bury the box?" At that point, I was more curious than scared, but something felt wrong. Like the air in the room had shifted, colder, heavier. The planchette shot towards the board's top corner, toward the letters spelling W-O-O-D-S. "The woods?" Kaylee asked, wide-eyed. She was standing behind Brian now, like she didn't want any part of it but still couldn't look away. Josh was practically leaning into the board, too invested to care about how freaked out we were. "What's in the box? What are we burying?" For a moment, nothing happened. The planchette didn't move. The silence in the room was unbearable, thick like molasses, and I felt a weird pressure in my ears, like when you're on an airplane. Then it jerked again, faster than before. "Why? Oh, you!" I felt a chill shoot down my spine. I wanted to laugh it off, pretend like it was just a game, but the weight of that moment settled over us like a dark cloud. Kaylee was already halfway up the stairs, whispering something about how we'd opened a door we shouldn't have. Sarah kept shaking her head, mumbling that we needed to stop, that it wasn't funny anymore. Josh, though, being Josh, leaned back with a smirk, like he was the only one who didn't feel the growing tension. "All right, so we bury ourselves in the woods?" Cool. Game over. He laughed, but it sounded forced, like even he wasn't sure anymore. That's when I should have left. We all should have. But instead, we stayed. We stayed because no one wanted to be the first to admit how creeped out we were. And that's where everything went downhill. Looking back, I wish I could say that was the worst part of the night. But it wasn't. Not even close. Part 2. A box in the woods. So, after the whole bury yourself in the woods thing, the vibe of the night had shifted. Kaylee was pretty much done, pacing nervously in the corner of the room, while Sarah kept trying to convince us that we should stop messing around with the board. Brian was cracking jokes. He's the type who laughs when he's uncomfortable, but even his laugh sounded forced. Josh? Well, Josh was all in. And of course, being the guy who never lets things go, he wanted to take it further. So, woods, Josh said, with this fake casual tone, like we hadn't just gotten the most bizarre response from a Ouija board. He looked around at us, eyebrows raised. We could check it out. Dude, it's the middle of the night, I said, and it's freezing out there. I was hoping that would be enough to shut the whole thing down, but I should have known better. Josh lived for this kind of stuff. Anything creepy, weird, or just flat out dangerous. He loved pushing boundaries, seeing how far he could take things, and apparently dragging us along with him. We don't have to go deep into the woods, he argued. Just, see if anything's out there. Besides, we've all been drinking. What better time for a midnight adventure, right? Sarah gave him a sharp look. Or we could not wander into the woods based on what some board game told us. Seriously, Josh, this is stupid. That thing's not a joke. Brian, still trying to laugh off the tension, clapped his hands together. I mean, I'm down if you guys are. If there's some creepy box out there with my name on it, I kinda want to see it. Kaylee didn't say anything. She was standing by the stairs now, like she was ready to bolt at any second. I think she was the only one who really understood how bad of an idea this was. In the end, we let Josh convince us. Peer pressure's a real thing, even when you know better. So we bundled up, grabbed a couple flashlights, and headed out. Josh lived on the edge of this small town, and his house was practically backed up against a huge stretch of woods. The kind of woods where the trees are so close together that even in daylight, it feels like dusk. At night, pitch black. We walked in silence for a while, just the sound of our footsteps crunching in the leaves and the occasional shuffle of jackets. The further we got from the house, the more uncomfortable I felt. I couldn't explain it, but something about the air felt heavy, like the woods were watching us. The cold bit into my skin, but it was more than that. It felt wrong. I glanced at Sarah, who was walking beside me. She hadn't said much since we left the house, but I could tell she was freaked out. Her eyes were scanning the trees like she expected something to jump out at any moment. How far are we going? Kaylee asked from behind us, her voice shaky. Josh, who was leading the way, pointed his flashlight further into the woods. Just a little further. Trust me, this is going to be awesome. You guys are going to be talking about this for years. Brian laughed. Yeah, if we don't end up in a true crime documentary. We walked for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only 15 minutes. The deeper we went, the thicker the trees got, their branches intertwining above us, blocking out what little moonlight there was. The only light came from our flashlights, which flickered every now and then, casting long, eerie shadows. Then, Josh stopped. "Hold up," he said, his voice suddenly serious. We all halted behind him. My heart was racing for no reason I could pinpoint, like my body knew something was wrong even before my brain could process it. "Do you guys see that?" Josh pointed his flashlight into a small clearing up ahead. At first, I didn't notice anything, just more trees and underbrush. But then, as his light passed over a certain spot, I saw it. A mound. It was subtle, almost hidden among the dead leaves and dirt, but there was a distinct shape. A raised patch of earth that didn't match the rest of the ground. Is that... Kaylee's voice was barely a whisper. Josh, of course, was already moving toward it, like he'd just won the lottery. I knew it, he said under his breath, shining his flashlight over the mound. It's a buried box, has to be. We all hung back, unsure whether to follow. I mean, sure, the Ouija board had mentioned burying something in the woods, but it was a game, right? There was no way this was connected. No way Josh would actually find something. But then, Josh dropped to his knees and started digging with his hands. Dude, what the hell are you doing? I asked, half laughing, half nervous. Helping fate along, he said, not looking up. If it told us to bury a box, then we're going to find the box. The more he dug, the clearer the shape became. And then, after what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two, I heard the sound of wood scraping against dirt. Josh paused, catching his breath, then wiped the dirt away with his sleeve. He grinned up at us, triumphant. There it is, he said. Sure enough, there was a box, an old weathered wooden box, barely big enough to hold a few personal items. It looked ancient, like it had been buried there for years. The wood was warped and cracked, but it was intact. Josh brushed the rest of the dirt off and sat back on his heels, admiring his find, like it was some kind of treasure. Brian stepped forward, peering over Josh's shoulder. So, are you going to open it or what? Josh grinned up at him. Hell yeah, I'm opening it. What do you think we came out here for? He grabbed the edges of the box and pulled it free from the dirt. It came loose with a soft, wet squelch, like the earth didn't want to let go. The lid was barely held on by rusted hinges, and when Josh lifted it, the wood creaked like it was seconds away from snapping. We all gathered around, leaning in to see what was inside. But when Josh opened the box, his grin faded. It was empty. Or it should have been. Because the second the lid popped open, the cold hit us harder. Not just the regular night chill. It was like the temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant. I could see my breath fogging up the air, and it felt like something had just sucked the warmth out of the world. Josh laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. Guess we missed the party, he joked, though no one else was laughing. I don't know how to explain it, but something felt off in that moment. Like the box wasn't really empty. Like there was something there, something we couldn't see, but it was watching us. Let's go, Sarah said quietly, tugging at my arm. We shouldn't have come here. I didn't argue. None of us did. Even Josh, who had been so eager to dig it up, didn't seem like he wanted to stay any longer. He closed the box and stood up, brushing dirt off his hands, though his usual cockiness was gone. We turned and headed back toward the house, faster than we had come. No one spoke. No one joked. We just wanted to get out of the woods. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not ours. Something heavier, following us. But when I turned around, flashlight sweeping through the trees, there was nothing there. Just shadows. Part 3. The night got worse. We practically power walked out of the woods after hearing those footsteps. I don't know how to describe it. This feeling that something was following us, watching us. Every time I glanced back, the beam of my flashlight caught nothing but trees and shadows, but my gut screamed at me that something was out there, and that it wasn't friendly. None of us spoke as we reached the edge of the woods and stepped back into Josh's yard. The house was a dark silhouette against the night, its windows like empty, unblinking eyes. The comfort of the indoors, where just an hour ago we'd been laughing and drinking, felt a million miles away. When we finally got inside, Sarah slammed the door behind us, her breathing heavy, as if closing it could keep whatever was out there from following. We all stood there in the hallway for a moment, the silence almost suffocating. It was like we were all waiting for someone to make the first move, to say something that would explain what had just happened. Josh, for once, didn't have a joke lined up. He was holding the box, his knuckles white around the edges, and his face was pale. All right, that was weird, he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Kaylee, who hadn't said a word since we left the woods, spoke up. "You need to get rid of that thing," she said, her voice shaky but firm. She pointed at the box like it was radioactive. "It's not a game, Josh. That, whatever it wasn't just a coincidence." Josh chuckled nervously, trying to brush it off. "It's just an empty box, Kaylee. What's the big deal?" But none of us believed him. Not even Josh, if I'm being honest. Brian, who had been unusually quiet during the whole walk back, finally chimed in. "We all felt it, man. Something's not right. I don't know if it's the board, or the woods, or that creepy-ass box, but I think we've messed with something we shouldn't have." Sarah nodded, standing closer to me, like she wanted to be as far from that box as possible. We shouldn't have gone out there, and we definitely shouldn't have brought that back. I agreed with them. Every instinct I had was screaming to get the box out of the house, burn it, bury it, toss it in a river, anything but keep it here. But Josh was still holding onto it like he wasn't ready to let go, like he didn't want to admit he was scared. Then, as if the universe had heard us, the lights flickered. It was just a second, but it was enough to send my heart racing. 1 second, the hallway was dimly lit by the old light overhead, and the next, we were plunged into darkness before the light flickered back on. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. I could hear Kaylee muttering something under her breath, probably a prayer. Josh stared up at the light, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Faulty wiring," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Brian was the first to break the silence. "Dude, I don't care what you think that thing is, but you need to get it out of here. Like, now." Josh finally set the box down on the coffee table, and I noticed that his hands were shaking. "Fine. We'll get rid of it tomorrow. It's late. I'm tired. We'll burn it or something in the morning." None of us liked that idea, but I guess we were all too freaked out to argue. We tried to go back to normal after that. Sarah and I sat on the couch. Brian grabbed another beer, probably to calm his nerves, and Kaylee was fidgeting with her phone, probably texting someone about how messed up the night had gotten. Josh, being Josh, started to scroll through his phone too, like nothing had happened, though his eyes kept flicking back to the box like it might suddenly move. Then, around midnight, things started getting weird. We were sitting there, trying to distract ourselves with a movie, when I started hearing it, a soft, scratching noise, like nails on wood. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe the wind pushing branches against the house. But the longer I listened, the more I realized it was coming from the coffee table, from the box. I didn't say anything at first because, well, who's going to admit they're hearing weird noises when everyone's already freaked out? But when I looked at Sarah, her eyes were wide, and I knew she heard it too. "Do you guys hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the TV. Everyone froze. The scratching got louder, more distinct, like something was inside the box, trying to claw its way out. Kaylee jumped up from her seat, backing away from the coffee table. "Nope! Nope! This is not happening," she whispered, shaking her head. "Josh, get rid of it, right now." But Josh just sat there, staring at the box, frozen. His bravado from earlier had evaporated, replaced by something I hadn't seen in him before. Fear. Real, bone-deep fear. "I'm not hearing anything," Brian said, though his voice was tight. He looked at us like he wanted to believe what he was saying, but it was clear he was hearing it too. The scratching stopped. We all held our breath, waiting for something else to happen, but the silence that followed was almost worse. It was like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. And then, the box moved. I'm not exaggerating. It didn't just shift slightly. It slid across the table, like someone had yanked it. Sarah gasped, jumping up next to Kaylee. Even Brian, who had been playing it cool, stood up, staring at the box like it had just grown legs. Josh slowly stood up, never taking his eyes off the box. "All right," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Maybe we should get rid of it. Now. No one argued. We grabbed the box, careful not to touch it directly, just used a towel to wrap it up, and headed to the backyard. The night air was even colder now, biting into our skin as we stood in Josh's overgrown backyard. There was a fire pit off to the side, mostly unused, but it felt like the safest option. Josh dumped the box into the fire pit, unwrapping the towel as carefully as if it were a bomb about to go off. I half expected the thing to start scratching again, or worse, but it just sat there, lifeless, silent. "All right," Josh said, his breath visible in the cold air. "Let's burn it." He grabbed a gas can from the garage, poured some over the box, and lit a match. We all stood in a tense circle around the pit, watching as the flames licked at the old wood. At first the fire seemed normal. The flames caught, and the wood began to crackle and burn. But then, as the flames grew higher, the temperature dropped again, way lower than it should have. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me, and glanced around to see if anyone else felt it too. That's when the voices started. They were faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they were getting louder, closer. It sounded like they were coming from the woods, surrounding us. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded. Yeah, I hear it." We all heard it. The voices, the whispers, growing louder with every passing second. They weren't human. They were distorted, broken, like something mimicking speech, but not quite getting it right. And then, just as suddenly as they started, the voices stopped. The fire had gone out. The box was still sitting there in the pit, charred but not destroyed. It hadn't burned. We all stared at it, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. The woods behind us were silent, but it was a suffocating silence, like the calm before something terrible. Josh finally broke the silence. "Guys, what do we do now?" No one answered, because none of us had an answer. Part 4, the things we brought back. Standing in Josh's backyard, staring at the unburnt box sitting in the fire pit, it felt like the world had come to a standstill. The voices were gone, but the silence was thick, almost alive, like it was waiting for something. None of us moved for what felt like forever. We just stared at that box, the one that should have burned but didn't, and in that moment, I realized something. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to be easy to get rid of. Josh ran a hand through his hair, clearly rattled. "This doesn't make any sense," he said, almost to himself. "It should have burned. Wood burns. It's not normal." Kaylee was pacing back and forth, muttering under her breath. She stopped suddenly, glaring at Josh like this was all his fault. "I told you," she said, her voice shaking with frustration. "I told you not to mess with it. We need to call someone, a priest or somebody who knows what the hell this is." Sarah, standing next to me, didn't say anything. She was staring at the box with this distant look in her eyes, like she wasn't really with us anymore, like part of her had stayed back in those woods. I squeezed her hand, hoping to snap her out of it, but she didn't react. Brian, who had been unusually quiet up until now, finally spoke. "Guys, maybe we should just leave it. Get out of here. Maybe it's better if we just walk away." He looked at each of us, his voice lowering. "Like, we don't have to deal with this. We could just go." For a moment, I considered it. Running. Leaving that box, that house, the whole night behind us. But then I remembered the footsteps in the woods, the voices, the feeling that we were being watched. And something told me that if we left, it wouldn't stop. This thing, whatever it was, it wouldn't just go away. Josh, still staring at the box, finally snapped. "We can't just leave it," he shouted, kicking the side of the fire pit in frustration. "What if it follows us? What if it doesn't stop?" He was breathing hard, his voice edging on panic. "There has to be a way to destroy it." Sarah spoke up, her voice flat. We shouldn't have brought it back." Her words hung in the air, and I could see the regret on everyone's faces. But it was too late for that now. We had brought it back, and we had no idea how to deal with it. Kaylee, still pacing, stopped and pointed toward the woods. "We need to bury it. Put it back where we found it. Maybe that'll, I don't know, undo whatever this is." I hated that idea. The last thing I wanted was to go back into those woods, especially at night. But it was the only plan anyone had, and no one was coming up with anything better. Josh nodded, though his face was pale. "Fine, we'll bury it, but we're doing it together. No one's splitting up, okay?" We all agreed. No one was about to be left alone after everything that had happened. So we grabbed shovels from Josh's garage, wrapped the box back in the towel, and headed toward the woods again. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the darkness was pressing down on us, thick and suffocating. The trees loomed over us, their branches twisting together like claws, and every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of our footsteps, the occasional snap of a twig. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, but the only thing behind us was the long stretch of shadow. When we finally reached the clearing where we'd found the box, we all stopped. No one wanted to be the first to step forward, to start digging. The air was colder here, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for us to make a move. "Let's get this over with," Brian muttered, gripping his shovel. We started digging. The dirt was hard and packed, but we worked fast, driven by this need to just get it done. Josh unwrapped the box, his hands trembling as he lowered it into the hole we'd made. For a second, I thought I saw something. Just a flicker of movement from the box, like a shadow shifting under the surface. But I blinked, and it was gone. We filled the hole as fast as we could, packing the dirt down with our shovels, and then we just stood there, staring at the mound of earth, hoping that was it, that burying the box would fix everything. But deep down, none of us believed it. Josh broke the silence first. "That's it, right? We buried it. It's over." No one answered, because none of us knew. And the thing is, the woods didn't feel any different. The air still felt heavy, oppressive, like we hadn't fixed anything, like we'd just pissed it off. "We should leave," Sarah whispered. "Now." We turned to go, but before we'd taken 2 steps, I heard it. That scratching sound. My heart sank as I realized it wasn't coming from the direction of the box, but from underneath us. The ground beneath our feet seemed to shift, and the scratching grew louder, more frantic, like something was trying to claw its way back up. "Oh my God," Kaylee whispered, stepping back, her face pale. "It's not staying buried." Josh grabbed his flashlight and pointed it at the mound, his hand shaking so badly that the beam of light jittered across the ground. The dirt was moving, tiny shifts at first, but then larger, as if something below was pushing against it. "We need to get out of here," Brian said, his voice rising in panic. "Now, before it—" He didn't finish his sentence, because the mound of dirt exploded. It happened so fast. 1 second, we were standing there, staring in horror, and the next, the ground erupted in a spray of dirt and rocks. Something shot out of the hole, something dark and fast, too fast to see clearly. It was a blur of movement, shadow and cold, like the air had been sucked out of the clearing. We all ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I just ran as fast as I could, Sarah right beside me, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear Josh and Brian behind us, and somewhere in the distance, Kaylee was screaming, but I couldn't tell where she was. The woods blurred around us as we tore through the trees, branches whipping at our faces, our lungs burning with the cold night air. That thing, whatever it was behind us. I could feel it, like this weight on my back, like it was closing in. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew one thing. It wasn't going to let us leave. We burst out of the woods and into Josh's backyard, collapsing onto the cold, wet grass. I turned around, expecting to see something charging out of the trees after us. But there was nothing. The woods were silent, the trees standing still and dark like they had been all night. But I knew better. I knew it was still there, watching us. "We can't stay here," Sarah gasped, clutching my arm. "It's not over." She was right. We couldn't stay. Whatever we had let out of that box, it wasn't just in the woods anymore. It was with us. Part 5. What followed us home. We barely made it inside Josh's house before everything went to hell. The second we slammed the door behind us, there was this deep, vibrating thud against the walls. Not like something hit the house, but like the whole building groaned, shuddering under some invisible pressure. Sarah was clutching my arm so tightly that I thought she might draw blood, but I didn't dare shake her off. My own heart was beating too fast, my mind racing. Josh was pacing back and forth in the hallway, his face pale, eyes wide, like he was trying to figure out what to do next. Kaylee and Brian were by the window, both of them staring out into the backyard, like they were expecting something to crawl out of the woods at any moment. For a long, tense moment, none of us spoke. We were all trying to catch our breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That thing, the thing that had exploded from the ground, was still out there. Or worse, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was inside with us now. Josh broke the silence first. "What the hell was that?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, like he was afraid to speak too loud in case whatever was out there could hear us. We buried it. We did everything right. Why didn't it work? Kaylee shook her head, still staring out the window, her breath fogging up the glass. Because it's not just the box. It never was. We woke something up, and now it's following us. The weight of her words sank in like a punch to the gut. Following us. Not just haunting the woods. Not just tied to the box. United States. Brian turned away from the window, his face pale. "Guys, we can't stay here. It's not safe. We need to leave. Now." "No," Sarah said suddenly, her voice sharp and shaking. "It'll follow us. Wherever we go, it'll come. Don't you get it? We're already screwed." Her words hit harder than I expected because deep down I knew she was right. I felt it too, this cold grip tightening around my chest. This sense that no matter what we did, we couldn't escape it. It was tied to us now, burying the box, running from the woods. It was all just stalling the inevitable. Josh grabbed his phone, swiping at the screen with shaking fingers. "I'm calling someone," he muttered. "Maybe a priest. I don't care. We need help. Someone needs to know how to stop this." Before any of us could argue, his phone blinked out. The screen went black. He stared at it, dumbfounded, before cursing under his breath. "Battery's dead. Great timing." Kaylee let out a nervous laugh, the kind that doesn't come from humor but from sheer panic. Of course it is." I pulled my own phone from my pocket. Dead. Same with Brian and Kaylee's, even Sarah's. All of our phones, fully charged when we'd left the house earlier, were now completely drained. The air in the room felt thicker, heavier, like something was pressing in on us from all sides. Then the lights flickered. Not just a quick flicker like before, but a slow, drawn-out dimming, as if the power itself was being sucked out of the house. The overhead light buzzed and flickered again, casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. Every shadow seemed too dark, too deep, as if it could swallow us whole. And then the scratching started. It was faint at first, coming from upstairs. A soft, dragging sound, like nails scraping over wood. It grew louder, more frantic, echoing through the walls. My throat tightened. The sound wasn't just coming from one place. It was everywhere. Above us, below us, inside the walls. The house itself seemed to groan, like something was moving through it, crawling, searching. Sarah whimpered next to me, pressing closer, her nails digging into my arm. "It's inside," she whispered, barely audible. "It's already inside." Josh grabbed the nearest object, a fireplace poker, and stood in front of us like he was ready to fight something. I don't know what he thought he could do against whatever was happening, but I appreciated the gesture. None of us knew what to do. We were trapped. There was no running from this. The scratching grew louder, and with it, the temperature in the room dropped again, so cold that I could see my breath. The shadows on the walls twisted, stretching unnaturally. Something moved in the hallway, just out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned there was nothing there, just more shadows. Then from upstairs came a sound that made my blood run cold. A voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but we all heard it. And the worst part, it wasn't a stranger's voice. It was me, my voice calling from upstairs. "Come up here," the voice said. "Come on, I'm waiting." I froze, my legs refusing to move. It was me, exactly my voice. The same pitch, the same tone, but twisted, like something was mimicking it. It was coming from the bedroom upstairs. "Don't," Sarah whispered, clutching my arm tighter. "Don't listen." But then, it wasn't just my voice anymore. I heard Brian's voice, Kaylee's, Sarah's. All of us calling from different rooms upstairs, repeating the same eerie invitation. "Come up here." I felt like I was going to be sick. My head was spinning, my heart pounding in my chest. It was like the house itself had become alive, taunting us, pulling us in. I could hear footsteps above, slow and deliberate, like something was pacing, waiting. Josh started toward the stairs, gripping the fireplace poker so tight that his knuckles were white. "We need to see what it wants." "No!" Kaylee stepped in front of him, her eyes wide with fear. "Are you insane? That's what it wants. It's trying to lure us in." Josh hesitated, his grip loosening. "Then what do? We can't just wait for it to come down here." The scratching grew louder, more frantic, almost deafening now. And with it, the voices got clearer. My own voice, but closer, like it was just outside the door. "Come here. Come on. I'm right here." I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe it was pure panic, or maybe some part of me thought I could fix this. But I grabbed the box of matches from the mantel. My hands were trembling as I struck a match and held it up to the edge of the rug, letting the flame catch. "What are you doing?" Brian shouted, stepping back as the fire started to spread. "Burn it," I said, my voice shaking. "We have to burn it all. The house, the box, everything." For a second, no one moved. They just stared at me like I'd lost it, and maybe I had. But then Josh nodded, his expression grim. "Do it." We backed away as the flames grew, spreading quickly across the dry wood floor. The heat grew intense, licking up the walls, but I didn't care. Whatever was in this house, whatever we had brought back with us, needed to be destroyed. If that meant burning everything to the ground, so be it. The voices grew louder, more desperate now, as the fire consumed the room. The house shook, the walls groaning like they were alive. I could hear my own voice screaming from upstairs, begging us to stop, but I knew better. It wasn't me. It was never me. We ran outside, watching as the flames engulfed the house. The fire roared, orange light spilling into the night sky. For a second, I thought I saw something in the window, just a shadow watching us, but then it was gone, swallowed by the flames. We stood there, out of breath, out of answers, watching as the house burned down to ash. It didn't feel like a victory. And as we stood in the cold night air, the fire reflecting in our eyes, I heard it again. Faint, from the trees behind us, the scratching. We asked the Ouija board about the afterlife. It started giving us directions to a cemetery. Part 1. A boring night turned creepy. Alright, I've got to start by saying this wasn't even supposed to be a big deal. It was just another regular boring Friday night at my friend Evan's place. You know how it is when you're hanging out with friends and nothing's really happening? So we're sitting there, flipping through Netflix like we're about to discover some hidden treasure. But after about an hour, we gave up. It was me, Evan, his girlfriend, Kayla, and my cousin Tyler. Now, Tyler. He's always been that guy who's into weird stuff. He's the type who reads all those conspiracy theories and watches videos about the deep web, aliens, and all that creepy pasta crap. So when he brought up the Ouija board, it wasn't that surprising. Here's the thing. I've never really been into that kind of stuff. Ghosts? Nah. Demons? No thanks. I was always the skeptic, the one who laughed off haunted house stories. But Kayla? Oh, she was all for it. She started digging through her closet and found this dusty old Ouija board she'd picked up from some antique shop months ago. She hadn't even used it before. I remember how casual everything felt. We were just chilling, laughing, making stupid jokes. But once that board hit the table, things got weird. And I don't mean like, ooh, spooky ghost weird. I mean it was too quiet all of a sudden. The kind of quiet that makes you realize you've been talking too loud. And now every little noise feels like it's under a microscope. The lights in Evan's living room were dim, and there was this single candle flickering on the coffee table, casting these long, creepy shadows across the walls. Looking back, it was honestly the perfect horror movie setup, but at the time, it just felt like another dumb experiment. Evan, being the natural leader of the group, suggested we ask something simple to start, just to test the waters, as he put it. So Kayla, Tyler and I all placed our fingers on the planchette while Evan called out the first question. Is anyone here with us? And of course, nothing happened. I was ready to roll my eyes and make a joke about how these things never work when Tyler grinned like a madman and decided to ask something way more intense. What's the afterlife like? I don't know if it was the question or the atmosphere or what, but this is when things started to get real. The planchette, which had been dead still, suddenly jerked to the side, making a sharp movement. Now, I swear none of us moved it. Kayla's face went pale, and she shot a look at Evan like, "Are you messing with me?" But he seemed just as confused as the rest of us. The planchette moved to N, then O. No. Simple enough. No afterlife. Cool. Nothing creepy about that, right? We all kind of laughed it off, but Tyler wasn't satisfied. He was always the one to push things, to see how far he could go. "Okay, so where do we go when we die?" he asked next. And then, it got worse. The planchette started to move again, this time slower, but with more purpose. It spelled out F-O-L-L-O-W. Follow. Follow what? We were all kind of looking at each other, and then Kayla spoke up. "Follow where?" The board seemed to take a pause, almost like it was thinking, and then the planchette started to spell out something else. It spelled out R-O-A-D. Road. I thought it was just random nonsense, but then it kept going. L-A-K-E-W-O-O-D. Lakewood Road. Evan sat back, eyes wide. Dude, that's like 20 minutes from here. No one said anything for a few seconds. We just sat there, the candle still flickering, the shadows still dancing around us. And I could feel my heart rate pick up, just a little. Because yeah, I was a skeptic, but this didn't feel right. It wasn't some stupid horror movie moment. This was real, too real. Tyler, of course, was all for it. He was already up and grabbing his keys. "We've got to check this out, man. What if it's some kind of hidden clue? Like a secret treasure or something?" Kayla wasn't having it. She wanted to stop, to just put the board away and call it a night. But Evan, he was curious. He always liked pushing things too, in his own way. So after a little more convincing, we all piled into Evan's beat-up Jeep, Ouija board and all, and headed for Lakewood Road. Now, here's the thing. I've driven down Lakewood Road before, and there's nothing creepy about it. It's just an old road near the outskirts of town. But as we got closer, the atmosphere shifted. The trees on either side of the road were thick, casting shadows across the pavement, and the further we went, the less I recognized the area. By the time we reached the end of the road, it was pitch black outside, and the air felt heavy, if that makes sense. Like something was waiting for us. I don't know how to explain it, but we parked the car at this old, rusted-out gate leading to what looked like a small, abandoned cemetery. No one said a word. Tyler was already out of the car, Ouija board under his arm, heading straight for the gate like it was no big deal. I remember standing there, heart pounding, my breath coming out in short gasps. I wanted to tell them all to go home, that this was stupid, but my legs wouldn't move. We followed Tyler into the cemetery, and that's when I noticed the grave markers. They weren't just any old gravestones. They were fresh. Part 2. The cemetery that wasn't supposed to be there, so there we were, standing in front of these gravestones that looked way too new for this forgotten, overgrown cemetery. I mean, this place was clearly old. You could tell by the rust on the gate, the crumbling stone wall that barely lined the perimeter, and the way the trees had grown wild and unchecked. But these graves, they were clean, like someone had just buried people there recently. The soil on a couple of them was even freshly turned. Tyler, of course, was already moving ahead, like he didn't even notice how wrong everything felt. He had the Ouija board tucked under his arm, stepping carefully between the graves, eyes darting around like he was on some kind of treasure hunt. Evan stayed close behind, phone flashlight cutting through the darkness, but it wasn't doing much. The shadows were thick, almost like they were swallowing the light. Kayla and I stayed back, closer to the gate, just watching them. I don't know about her, but I had this weird feeling in my gut. Like, you ever get that feeling when you're doing something you know you shouldn't be doing? That sinking sensation? Yeah, that's exactly how I felt. I kept telling myself we should leave, that this whole thing was a bad idea. But every time I opened my mouth, the words just stuck. Tyler finally stopped near this big, old oak tree that stood dead center in the cemetery. Its branches stretched out like bony arms, almost touching the tops of the gravestones beneath it. He set the Ouija board down on one of the graves, yeah, on a grave, and sat cross-legged next to it like this was all some kind of casual Saturday night adventure. Evan joined him, shining his light over the board as they both put their fingers back on the planchette. I looked over at Kayla, and she had this wide-eyed, nervous look, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold in her fear. "This feels wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. I nodded, but I didn't move. I guess part of me was curious too, even though I'd never admit it. Tyler started asking questions again, but this time his voice was more serious, less playful than before. "What do you want from us?" The planchette moved immediately, not slow and uncertain like back at the house. No, this was different. It was deliberate, almost impatient. It spelled out L-A-K-E-W-O-O-D again, Lakewood. The road we were already on. No new information. But then the planchette kept moving, faster now, like it was desperate to get something across. S-E-C-O-N-D. Evan glanced at Tyler, raising an eyebrow. "Second what?" he asked, clearly confused. And that's when the planchette moved again, this time spelling something even weirder. D-E-A-T-H. Kayla sucked in a sharp breath, and I swear my heart skipped a beat. Second death. What the hell was that supposed to mean? Tyler was grinning again, but there was a nervousness behind his eyes. "I think it's trying to tell us something about the afterlife, man," he said, voice low. "Maybe like, there's more after you die the first time. Now, I know what you're thinking. This was all probably just some dumb prank, right? But here's the thing. None of us were moving that planchette. I swear to you, none of us. And even if one of us had been screwing around, how would we explain what happened next?" While Tyler was still trying to make sense of the second death thing, we heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, like the wind, but it was there, clear as day. And it wasn't coming from any of us. I looked around, thinking maybe someone else was in the cemetery, but there was no one, just us and the gravestones. Kayla's face drained of all colour. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Tell me you heard that." Tyler froze, his hand hovering over the planchette. His grin was gone now, replaced by a look of genuine confusion. "Okay, that was weird," he muttered. Evan pointed his flashlight toward the far side of the cemetery, where the sounds seemed to be coming from. But all we saw were more gravestones, rows and rows of them, disappearing into the shadows beyond the reach of the light. And then the whisper came again, louder this time, like it was right behind us. "Go." I whipped around, shining my phone's flashlight into the darkness behind us, but there was nothing. No one, just the wind blowing through the trees. But that voice, it wasn't the wind, it was a voice, low, almost raspy, like someone barely hanging on to life. We all heard it that time. Kayla grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "This isn't funny anymore," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. Tyler stood up, finally looking like he was starting to realize this wasn't some game. "Maybe we should," he started to say, but he didn't get to finish his sentence, because out of nowhere, the ground beneath the grave we were standing on started to crack. I kid you not, the dirt shifted, like something underneath was pushing up. It was subtle at first, just a slight movement, but then the earth literally bulged, rising like something, or someone, was trying to claw its way out. Kayla screamed and bolted toward the gate, and honestly, I wasn't far behind. I didn't care what was going on anymore. I just wanted out. But before I could take more than a few steps, something cold brushed against my ankle. It felt like a hand. I looked down, and there, barely visible in the faint light of Evan's phone, was a bony, pale hand sticking out of the ground. That was it. That was the last straw. I yanked my leg free and sprinted for the gate. Evan and Tyler were right behind me, neither of them saying a word, just running like their lives depended on it. We didn't stop until we were back in the Jeep, doors slammed shut, and engine revving. As we sped away from the cemetery, none of us spoke. The only sound was Kayla's quiet sobbing in the back seat. I glanced back one last time as we drove away, and I swear I saw a figure standing just inside the gate. Tall, thin, and motionless, watching us. We didn't stop until we were back at Evan's place, and even then, none of us could bring ourselves to talk about what had just happened. Not yet, at least. We just sat there, in silence, trying to process everything. Tyler still had the Ouija board clutched in his hands, like he couldn't let it go. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we'd done, it wasn't over. Part 3. Unfinished business. When we got back to Evan's house, it was like nobody knew what to do next. We just sat there in the living room, all of us in this weird, uncomfortable silence. The only sound was Kayla's shaky breathing, and even that felt too loud. None of us wanted to be the first to speak, because once you say something out loud, it makes it real, right? Tyler was still holding the Ouija board. His knuckles were white from gripping it so hard, and I could tell he was spooked, even though he kept trying to play it cool. The dude loved messing with weird stuff, but this was different. He wasn't grinning anymore. His face was pale, and every few minutes he'd look over his shoulder, like he expected something to be standing there. Evan was the first to break the silence. "What the hell was that?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't even a question, really. More like a thought he couldn't keep in his head anymore. Nobody answered him. I think because none of us could answer him. What were we supposed to say? That a dead person tried to grab us? That we'd just visited some cemetery that wasn't even supposed to exist? None of it made sense. Finally, Tyler sat up straighter, his voice low but urgent. "We have to go back." I stared at him like he'd lost his damn mind. "Go back? Are you kidding me?" "I'm serious, man," Tyler shot back, his eyes wide and intense. We didn't finish what we started. The Ouija board was trying to tell us something, and we bailed before we figured it out. We have to know. Kayla shook her head violently. No way. We are not going back there. Didn't you see? Her voice broke, and she covered her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. That thing, it touched us. It touched us. She wasn't wrong. I could still feel the cold grip on my ankle, like a ghostly reminder that none of this was over. But going back? Hell no. I wasn't about to step foot in that place again. But Tyler, he was stubborn. When he got an idea in his head, it was impossible to shake it. And as much as I hated to admit it, I could tell that deep down, Evan was thinking about it too. He was always the curious one, the one who needed answers, no matter how dangerous it might be. Look, Tyler said, trying to keep his voice steady. There's something going on here that we don't understand. That voice we heard, it told us to go. But where? Why? We didn't finish the session. We need to go back and figure it out. Evan looked torn. He kept glancing between me and Tyler like he was trying to weigh his options. But before he could say anything, Kayla stood up and grabbed her bag. If you guys are seriously thinking about going back there, I'm done. I'm not sticking around to watch whatever happens next. This is insane. She was right. This was insane. We should have listened to her. But Tyler wouldn't let it go. Kayla, wait, Evan said, standing up and reaching for her, but she shook him off. I'm done, Evan. Whatever this is, it's not worth it. I'm not messing with spirits or demons or whatever the hell that was. I'm leaving. Her voice cracked at the end, and I could tell she was barely holding it together. She grabbed her car keys and bolted for the door. None of us tried to stop her, and honestly, I kind of wished I had followed her. But instead, I just sat there, staring at Tyler and Evan as they continued to argue over whether or not we should go back. It was like the fear from earlier had faded just enough for curiosity to creep back in, and as much as I hated to admit it, even I was wondering about that unfinished message. Second death. What did that mean? Eventually, Evan caved. Fine, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. We'll go back. But just for a few minutes. If things start getting weird again, we're out. I wanted to tell them both they were crazy. I wanted to say no. But the truth was, I was already grabbing my jacket and standing up. Something about that place had pulled me in, like it had latched onto all of us, even Kayla, I think, even though she ran. So, an hour later, we were back in the Jeep, heading toward Lakewood Road. The drive felt longer this time, and the air was thicker, heavier, like the world itself was telling us to turn around. None of us spoke as we drove, the headlights barely cutting through the darkness. When we finally reached the old gate, the cemetery looked even more twisted than before. The trees seemed taller, their branches curling like skeletal fingers reaching out for us. The gravestones looked darker, almost sharper somehow. I don't know how to explain it, but the whole place felt wrong, like it had changed in the short time we'd been gone. Tyler got out first, clutching the Ouija board like it was some kind of shield. I was slower, every instinct telling me to stay in the car, but I followed. Evan was behind me, his phone light cutting through the gloom, but it barely helped. As we walked through the cemetery, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. More graves. There were more graves than before. At first I thought I was imagining things, but no, the graves had multiplied. There were rows and rows of them now, stretching farther into the darkness, some of them with freshly turned soil. They weren't there earlier, I was sure of it. My mind raced, but I kept moving, not daring to say anything. I think part of me didn't want to acknowledge it. Maybe if I didn't speak it into existence, it wouldn't be real. We reached the oak tree where we'd used the board last time. The gravestone we had set the board on before was still there, but the ground beneath it looked even more disturbed, like something had been moving around underneath. Tyler set the Ouija board down, and we all crouched around it again. The wind had picked up, rustling through the leaves, but it felt wrong somehow. Colder, more deliberate. Evan spoke first this time. "What do you want from us?" The planchette didn't move. For a moment, I thought maybe it was all over, that maybe whatever spirit or energy we had contacted earlier had moved on. But then, slowly, the planchette dragged itself across the board. D-E-A-T-H. That again. Death. But this time, it didn't stop there. It spelled something else. Y-O-U. My breath caught in my throat, and I saw Evan's hands start to shake. Tyler's face was pale, and for the first time since we'd started this whole thing, I could see real fear in his eyes. Death. You. Before any of us could process what that meant, we heard it again. That whisper. But this time, it was louder, closer, right behind us. Go! We turned, and I swear to you, standing there just beyond the reach of the flashlight was a figure, tall, thin, and draped in shadows. Its face, if it even had one, was hidden, but its presence was unmistakable. It was watching us. The air around us grew cold, unbearably cold, and the ground beneath our feet trembled. Tyler was the first to move, scrambling to his feet and bolting for the car. Evan and I weren't far behind. We didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't speak. We just ran. But as we sped away from the cemetery, one thought kept racing through my mind. That figure hadn't moved. It hadn't chased us, because it didn't need to. It knew where we lived. Part 4. The Watcher. By the time we got back to Evan's house, my hands were still shaking. I couldn't stop thinking about that figure standing at the edge of the cemetery, just watching us. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. There wasn't anything human about it. No eyes, no face. Just a tall, dark shape, like a shadow that had taken form. But what really got to me was how it didn't even try to follow us. It knew. It knew exactly who we were. And worse, I had this gut-wrenching feeling it wasn't finished with us yet. Back inside Evan's place, things felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but the second we closed the door behind us, it was like the house wasn't the same anymore. It felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. The air was thick, almost suffocating. The lights seemed dimmer, even though we hadn't touched the switches. Every little sound, creaking floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, even the ticking clock on the wall, felt amplified, like the house itself was alive and watching us. Tyler dropped the Ouija board on the kitchen table with a loud thud, but no one said anything. He was pacing back and forth, running his hand through his hair, muttering under his breath. I could tell he was trying to figure it all out, trying to piece together what had just happened, but there was nothing to figure out. We'd opened some kind of door, and now something was coming through. That's what scared me the most. We weren't in control anymore. Evan sat down on the couch, burying his face in his hands. "What the hell did we do, man?" he mumbled through his fingers. He looked like he was about to lose it. Honestly, I didn't blame him. The whole situation felt like a bad dream we couldn't wake up from. "I don't know," Tyler replied, still pacing. I didn't expect whatever that was. It was just supposed to be some stupid game, you know? Get a few laughs, maybe freak each other out. But that thing, it's real." He stopped and looked at me, and for the first time since we started this whole nightmare, Tyler's voice cracked. We shouldn't have messed with it. The fear in his voice made everything worse. Tyler was always the guy who laughed in the face of danger, who pushed boundaries just to see what would happen. But now, he was scared. We all were. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from upstairs. We all jumped, our eyes snapping toward the ceiling. It sounded like something had fallen, a heavy, deliberate sound that echoed through the house. Evan stood up, his face pale. "What was that?" he whispered. None of us answered. Another bang, louder this time. Something was moving around up there, and it wasn't us. Evan slowly made his way to the foot of the stairs, glancing back at us like he was waiting for one of us to tell him it was nothing. that he was imagining things. But we all knew better. This wasn't our imagination. Whatever had been watching us at the cemetery hadn't stayed behind. It had followed us. Tyler was the first to grab a weapon. He yanked open a drawer in the kitchen and pulled out a large knife, gripping it tightly in his hand. "We can't just sit here," he said, his voice low and tense. "If something's up there, we need to know what it is." I didn't want to go. Every part of me was screaming to run, to get out of that house and never look back. But something else, a feeling I couldn't shake, kept me frozen. If we left, we weren't just leaving the house. We'd be leaving it unfinished. And I had this terrible thought that whatever was happening wasn't going to stop just because we ran. It would follow us, just like it had followed us from the cemetery. Reluctantly, I grabbed the closest thing I could find, an old wooden baseball bat leaning against the wall. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little less helpless. Evan grabbed a flashlight, and together we started up the stairs. The creaking with each step felt like the house was breathing, like it was aware of us, waiting for something to happen. The air got colder as we reached the second floor, and I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. It was unnatural, like the cold had come from somewhere else entirely, not from outside, but from some dark, hollow place. We moved down the hallway, past the closed bedroom doors, the flashlight beam cutting through the thick shadows. Every part of me was tense, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Tyler was ahead of us, holding the knife out in front of him, but even he looked like he was second-guessing this whole thing. Then we heard it, a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It came from the end of the hallway, where the door to the attic was. The sound stopped for a second, and then there was another bang, like something had hit the floor again. "I'm not going up there," Evan said, his voice barely a whisper. We all stood there, staring at the attic door, none of us moving. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what could possibly be up there. The figure from the cemetery? Or maybe something worse. The Ouija board had said, "Death you," and I couldn't stop thinking about that. Was that a warning? Or was it a promise? Tyler slowly reached for the attic door, his hand trembling. He looked back at us, and I could see the fear in his eyes. He was terrified, just like the rest of us, but something was driving him to see this through. He pulled the attic door down, the ladder creaking as it unfolded. The scraping sound started again, louder now, like whatever was up there knew we were coming. I gripped the bat tighter, every muscle in my body tense as Tyler climbed the ladder, disappearing into the darkness of the attic. The flashlight flickered in Evan's hand, casting eerie shadows along the walls. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then Tyler screamed. It wasn't a yell or a shout, it was a full-blown scream of terror, the kind that sends chills down your spine. I bolted up the ladder after him, my mind racing with every worst-case scenario you could imagine. As soon as I reached the top, I froze. Tyler was standing in the middle of the attic, his knife held up defensively, but he wasn't facing us. He was staring at the far corner of the room, eyes wide with fear. I followed his gaze and felt my blood turn to ice. The figure from the cemetery was standing in the corner, its dark, featureless body blending into the shadows. But now, up close, I could see it wasn't just standing there. It was pointing. Its long, bony arm was stretched out, and it was pointing directly at Tyler. The room grew colder, and I could feel the breath leave my lungs as I realized what was happening. The Ouija board hadn't been warning us. It had been giving instructions. Second death. You. Tyler backed up, his face pale, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, pointing, as if it was waiting for something. The air around us grew heavier, and I could feel this overwhelming sense of dread, like we were standing on the edge of something terrible. Suddenly, the attic window behind us shattered, glass flying everywhere, and a gust of freezing wind tore through the room. The figure disappeared, melting into the shadows like it had never been there at all. but the cold remained. And so did the feeling that something was coming, something worse. Tyler stumbled backward, his face pale, his breathing ragged. "We need to go," he gasped. "Now!" But as we turned to leave, the ladder we'd climbed up suddenly pulled itself up and slammed the attic door shut, trapping us inside. The house was no longer just a house, it was a trap. Part 5. The final message. We stood there, frozen, staring at the attic door. It had slammed shut with such force that the sound still echoed in my ears. I ran to it, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The ladder was gone, retracted into the ceiling like it had never been there, leaving us trapped. The only light was from Evan's flickering flashlight, barely cutting through the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and stretch along the walls. The cold was unbearable now, so cold it felt like it was seeping into my bones. My breath came out in short, rapid puffs, but I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the fear gnawing at my insides. Tyler stood in the center of the attic, still clutching the knife, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. He knew. We all knew. Whatever had followed us, whatever we had let in, it was still here, and it was waiting for something. Evan's flashlight flickered again, dimming, and then it went out completely. Plunged into darkness, the silence that followed was deafening. I couldn't see a thing, just blackness pressing in on all sides. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, using its dim screen to light up the space around us. The attic felt smaller now, the air heavier, almost like it was closing in. And then, from the corner of the room, that sound again, scraping. But this time, it was louder, closer. I swung my phone's light toward the sound, my heart hammering in my chest, and that's when I saw it. The figure was back, emerging from the shadows. It wasn't standing still this time. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, its long, bony arm dragging across the wooden floor, making that awful scraping noise. But there was something different now. Its other hand was raised, and in its twisted fingers, it held the Ouija board, the board that we had left downstairs. It was like the whole room dropped 10 degrees. The figure stood there, holding the board out toward us, like it wanted us to take it. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, my lungs burning, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare. Tyler was the first to break the silence. His voice was a shaky whisper, barely audible. "We're supposed to finish it." Evan shook his head violently. "No way, man. No way. We're not touching that thing again." But Tyler wasn't listening. He was already stepping forward, his hand trembling as he reached out for the board. I wanted to scream at him to stop, to run, but I couldn't get the words out. I just stood there, watching as he took the board from the figure. The second his fingers touched the planchette, the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped even more, and the walls began to groan, like the house itself was in pain. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on us, squeezing the air from my lungs. Tyler sat down in the middle of the floor, his hand on the planchette, eyes wide with terror, but determination. "We have to finish it," he whispered again, almost like he was trying to convince himself. He motioned for us to join him. I didn't want to. Every instinct in my body told me to get out of there, to run, and never look back, but there was nowhere to go. The attic door was locked. We were trapped, and the only way out was through whatever this was. Reluctantly, I sat down beside him, my fingers brushing the edge of the planchette. Evan followed, though his face was pale and drawn, his eyes wide with fear. The three of us sat there, fingers lightly touching the planchette, waiting. The figure loomed over us, its empty, hollow presence pressing down like a shadow that wouldn't leave. Tyler asked the question, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What do you want from us?" For a long moment, nothing happened. The room was deathly still, the only sound our shaky breaths. I was about to pull my hand away when the planchette jerked under our fingers, moving with a sudden, forceful motion. It slid across the board, spelling out letters one by one. D, E, A, T, H. There it was again. Death. My heart was racing, and I could feel a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. But it didn't stop there. The planchette kept moving. T, O, N, I, G, H, T. Death tonight. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I felt my stomach drop. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the board, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Before I could say anything, the planchette moved again, faster now, like whatever was controlling it was in a hurry. It spelled out more letters, rapid and forceful. R, U, N. I didn't need to be told twice. I shot to my feet, backing away from the board, my heart pounding in my chest. Tyler stood up too, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. Even Evan looked like he was ready to bolt, but there was nowhere to run. The attic door was still shut, locked tight, and the figure hadn't moved. It stood there, tall and silent, its hollow face staring down at us like it was waiting for something. The temperature in the room plummeted even further, and I could see my breath coming out in shallow gasps. Then, slowly, deliberately, the figure raised its arm again, pointing past us, toward the attic window. Evan was the first to see it. "Look!" he shouted, his voice tight with panic. I turned, following his gaze, and my heart stopped. Outside the window, standing in the yard below, were more figures. Dozens of them, tall, thin, and draped in shadow, all staring up at us. They weren't moving, just watching, waiting. "We've got to go," Evan stammered, backing away from the window. "We've got to get out of here now." Tyler was shaking his head, his hands gripping the Ouija board like it was his only lifeline. "It's too late," he whispered. "It's too late." Before he could finish, there was a loud creaking sound from behind us. The attic door slowly swung open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. But the house had changed. The walls were warped, twisted, and the shadows seemed to writhe like they were alive. The figure at the window started to move, and I could feel the air grow heavier. My chest tightened, and I knew we weren't meant to leave. But that instinct to survive kicked in, stronger than the fear. I grabbed Tyler by the arm, yanking him toward the door, and Evan was already sprinting down the hallway. We barreled down the stairs, the walls groaning and creaking around us, the floorboards shaking with every step. We didn't stop running until we were outside, the cold night air hitting us like a slap to the face. But the moment we stepped out of the house, something felt different. The figures were gone. The air was still, the silence deafening. We stood there, gasping for breath, staring back at the house. The front door was wide open, but there was no sign of the figures, no shadowy shapes moving inside. I turned to Tyler, my voice shaky. What the hell just happened?" Tyler didn't answer. He was staring at the Ouija board in his hands, his face pale, eyes wide with a terrible understanding. "I don't think we were meant to leave," he said, his voice barely audible. I think it's not over." And as I looked back at the house, at the open door, and the shadows that lingered just inside, I realized he was right. We hadn't escaped. We had only just begun.